In all this action, the Japanese claimed that only 6 men were lost. That last mission on September 30th brought an end to the first phase of the Kolum Bangara evacuation. At that point, the Rabaul High Command decided on a change in direction, because the evacuation of the 10,000 men on Kolum Bangara was taking far too long at Rabaul. It seemed far too dangerous to continue going on the way they had for the past few weeks. The American air and naval pressure grew stronger every day at Rabaul. The staff officers predicted that they would soon run into disaster, which meant loss of ships, and ships were like diamonds these days to the men involved in carrying out the withdrawal. The new policy came as a dreadful shock. Higher authority decreed that the withdrawal should be suspended because the program was straining the fleet's destroy resources. What somebody up top was talking about obviously was abandoning all the men south of Banville to the mercies of the enemy. The commander of the 8th Fleet gave the order, and many officers saw in the delay the death warrant for 8,000 men still on Kolum Bangara for 2 days. The debate continued at Rabaul until finally the matter was decided. General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka were convinced that it would be worse than useless to leave those men to die, so the command issued reaffirming orders: every man on Kolum Bangara will be rescued. And so on October 1, 1943, the rescue missions began again at Rabaul. The destroyer command made preparations for the first trip, which would bring the destroyers to the north end of Kolum Bangara. They would continue for the next week on an emergency basis. Having set the policy, Rabaul Command was going flat out to do the job. It all worked almost like clockwork under the noses of the Americans. Just as the Guadalcanal evacuation had been carried out by the end of the week, the Kolum Bangara withdrawal was complete. Virtually all of the 10,000 men had been taken off safely and moved either to Banville or to Rabaul. The command boasted to Tokyo that not one man in Aund had been left behind, given the Japanese decision to make the ultimate effort. What would have happened if Admiral Wilkinson had persisted in maintaining the cruisers up north is a matter for conjecture around the winter fire. Quite possibly, he would have lost a cruiser or two without seriously impeding the Japanese action, because the Japanese technique of evacuation eliminated the need for the destroyers to stand in dangerous harbours and wait like sitting ducks. The Japanese destroyers were ready to fight to protect the troops in the small boats. Certainly it would have been useful to the Allies to have stopped the retreat of those 10,000 men. But they were not in a position to do so, particularly since the Japanese were prepared to throw everything they had at True into the scale. To accomplish this evacuation, the Americans continued routine patrols, and in these the United States. Destroyers did sink some barges. They also caught the submarine 120 on the surface and sank her. Once or twice they chased Japanese destroyer groups, and in one running fight they put a few holes in the top side of the destroyer Sidar, but they did not really accomplish much. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison faults the United States Navy for not understanding the Japanese evacuation techniques and for misuse of planes, ships, and PT boats. It all went back to the basic unfamiliarity of the Americans with night fighting techniques. Planes and PT boats and ships got their signals mixed up, and the cruiser and destroyer officers were perhaps afraid of being torpedoed or bombed as much by their friends as by their enemies. The Americans were still not very comfortable in fighting night naval actions, although by far the majority of the fighting in the South Pacific had been and would be at night in view of later developments in the southern islands. It comes as something of a surprise to learn the extent of the effort the Japanese devoted to rescuing 600 or 700 men from Vel-La in the face of an approaching enemy. The Americans were literally swarming around Vel-Laela, yet the Japanese were to employ 9 destroyers to defend the barge and sub-chaser flotilla that would actually take the troops from Vel-La to Buen, a distance of about 50 miles. The whole fleet numbered 9 destroyers, 4 sub-chasers, and 20 barges. Admiral Uin was again in command. There is an interesting comparison between the manner of operation of Admiral Uin and one of his predecessors, Admiral Riso Tanaka, who was on the record the best destroyer commander the Japanese ever had. Tanaka had been given the first of the special missions during the Guadalcanal days. At that time, the Japanese Navy expected him to fight and deliver troops and supplies, and while placing a high priority on delivery, higher authority did not relieve the commander of the responsibility for winning a naval action at the same time. After several dangerous missions, Tanaka had the temerity to argue with Admiral Yamamoto that the use of destroyers to land supplies and reinforce troops was a misuse of weapons. Thereby Admiral Tanaka wrecked his career. Yamamoto hustled him out of the South Pacific, and he ended up running a sleepy navy yard in Rangoon. Admiral Uin was working under no such handicaps. He had already shown that he felt his primary responsibility was to his ships, and if necessary he would abandon a mission or delay it to keep out of a battle that might diminish the South Pacific's already strained destroyer fleet. And what Uin was doing was completely acceptable to his superiors. So much had the Pacific War already changed. The high officers of the Japanese General Staff still refused to think of themselves as on the defensive, except temporarily, but the facts spoke for themselves to the officers in the field. Before dawn, on the morning of October 6th, Admiral Uin set sail from Rabaul, with 6 fighting destroyers escorting 3 transport destroyers. Along the way they would pick up a number of sub-chasers, torpedo boats and barges. They would then evacuate the troops from the tip of Vilaela to Buen. Admiral Uin was commanding the force from the destroyer Akumo, and he was operating with a simple plan that he had used before successfully. His first group of 4 fast new destroyers, Akumo, Kazumo, Yugumo, and Isoki, were all read at 35 knots. They would search for the enemy and engage him if he came out to attack the transport train. Meanwhile, Captain Tamichi Hara, with the slower Shigure and Samidare, would be prepared to strike the enemy from another angle, and while the fighting destroyers kept the enemy at bay, the transports would slip off and do their work. This plan had worked to perfection several times in the past few months, and so was highly regarded at Rabaul. The problem, of course, was that the Americans had enough experience with this sort of operation to know what to expect. That was Captain Hara's argument, but it went unheeded. October 6th was the sort of day the Japanese liked dark and squall, which gave the Japanese a greater feeling of security against air attack as they moved down along the east coast of Banville. But their sense of security was misplaced. Their operational plan had been broadcast to the commander of the combined fleet, and the American radio interceptors had picked it up at Pearl Harbor. The message was decoded long before the ship set out, and Admiral Holly soon had the word. He advised Admiral Wilkinson that the Japanese would be coming down the slot to Marana Bay to reach Vilaela, and he told when they would come and in what number. Sure enough, on the afternoon of October 6th, an American search plane spotted the Japanese ships as they moved south, and a report was sent to Admiral Wilkinson. Admiral Wilkinson had a serious problem. The American destroyer force was heavily occupied just then in escorting convoys to Guadalcanal and Munda. The only 3 destroyers actually uncommitted were the Selfridge Chevalier and O'Bannon under command of Captain Frank Walker, which had been assigned to the patrol of the slot against Japanese troop movement. But since there were so many more Japanese ships involved, Wilkinson also detailed Captain Harold Larson with the Bal-Talbert Lavalette and Taylor to leave his convoy and hurry to Marana Bay to intercept the enemy in mid-afternoon. When the Japanese knew they had been spotted by the American plane, they altered their formation, increasing the distance between ships, and between the 3 groups of ships they expected air attack within a matter of hours. But the weather was so foul that no air attack arrived, although off Skizzle they did become aware of a number of planes that could not find them in the squalls at sunset. Admiral Ewan detached his fast destroyers from the rest of the group and told a signalman to use his blinker to warn the Onon, which was just behind. But the signalman, who had been knocked about by the blast, fainted before he could send the message. The Onon came charging up as the Chevalier backed, and the Onon rammed into the starboard side of the ship, her bow penetrating the Chevalier AF engine room. Probably the failure of the signalman made no difference, and in the heat of the battle, and given the sudden slowing of the Charla, the collision would seem to have been inevitable. The Selfridge continued to try to close on the Japanese, but the range was too great for the American torpedoes to reach the Japanese ships beyond the Yugumo. It was not, however, too great for the Japanese torpedoes. Earlier, during the wild manoeuvring, the Japanese destroyers Shigure and Samidare had launched 16 torpedoes. The Selfridge ran smack into one of these, and the explosion caused her to slow down and take water. There were many casualties, but fortunately no vital parts were destroyed, nor were the magazines hit. By this time, the 3 original American destroyers were out of the fight, but the 3 commanded by Captain Larson were just nearing the scene so they could get into it. As they came up, they were spotted by one of the Japanese float planes, which warned Admiral Uin, believing that at least 3 American cruisers were now descending on him. Admiral Uin turned and headed back for Rabaul, and the battle for Velleila came to an end. The result was a victory for the Japanese. In every sense, the troop transport destroyers had broken off at the first sign of action and headed for Velleil's North Shore base. Within the hour of arrival, they were loading the 600 or 700 troops, and an hour later were underway. Velleila was evacuated without the loss of a man, and the loss of life aboard the sunken Japanese destroyer Yugumo was believed to be complete, but in fact about a third of the crew, men, were rescued by American PT boats. That is remarkable, first, that the Japanese would submit to rescue, and second, that the Americans would continue the task. After one Japanese crewman rewarded an American sailor for a cup of coffee by killing him, when the battle ended, the Yugumo was sunk, and the American Charla had to be sunk by a torpedo from the Lavalette. The SRI's crew managed to make temporary repairs and get their crippled ship back to Targi. The Oanon made her way back, crippled bow and all, and a few days later was sent home to the United States for a breather and major repair. Japanese and American intelligence were some time in truly assessing the battle. It was a typical encounter in this campaign of attrition. The Americans came back claiming 3 destroyers sunk with damage to 3 or 4 more. Admiral Uin went back to Rabaul, believing he had faced a reinforced cruiser force and had sunk 2 of them as well as 3 destroyers. The Japanese had won the engagement, but they had lost another destroyer. The High Command was not pleased when Admiral Uin reported in Japanese fashion. He was not chided, but with considerable fanfare. Admiral Kusaka held a party at the officer club. He and Admiral Samima, commander of the Eith Fleet, made much of the presentation of a ceremonial sword and daggers to 3 of Uin's subordinates without a word for Uink performance. So much had the war changed that Admiral Uin, who had fought his battle and won, was nearly as badly disgraced as had been Admiral Tanaka, who had also won. Tanaka had knocked out a far superior force, but had failed to complete his mission of supplying the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. Admiral Uin had won his battle and carried out the task of withdrawing the troops brilliantly, and still he was in trouble. The official displeasure could be attributed to a growing realization that the war was going badly, and for the Japanese indeed it was. With the Battle of Velleila, the campaign for the Central Solomons was over, in spite of the attrition the Allies had won, and were now prepared to move ahead against the Northern Solomons. A few more victories, such as Admiral Uin's, said the Wags at Habal, and the Japanese Navy would lose the war. Admiral Holly had the Central Solomons, although there were times during the struggle for New Georgia when the campaign had threatened to become a fiasco. The worst problem for the Allies had been the misreading of the difficulties the Amphibious Command had asked for, about 3 times as many troops as it got. The request was rejected because the troops were not available. That lack has to be weighed against the apparent incompetence of the ground command and inexperienced troops. Furthermore, the Americans still had a good deal to learn about fighting the Japanese at sea. In spite of the enormous advantage of radar, the Allied Navy was still not winning all the sea victories. By far the Japanese army had withdrawn its air forces from the region during the New Georgia campaign. The army claimed the planes were needed to protect army installations and support army moves in New Guinea. The real reason was the same sort of antagonism that had caused the Navy pilots to blame the army for the death of Admiral Yamamoto. The cooperation ordered by Tokyo between services was never more than skin deep, except under the most rigorous circumstances. Despite the loss of the Army planes, the Naval Air Force was still potent. In fact, the Japanese Army Air Force never did amount to much in the Solomons campaigns. Its pilots were simply not well enough trained in that sort of combat. Perhaps encounters with the Japanese Army pilots accounted for the easy victories claimed by many American flyers. In any event, Americans tended to overly exaggerate their victories and underplay those of the enemy. This was a weakness shared by the Japanese at great cost to themselves. The most serious American error, perhaps, was to overestimate the numbers of Japanese casualties and underestimate the Japanese ability to withdraw troops. Admiral Halsey, who was fond of hyperbole, asserted that all Americans could fight better than all Japanese. How much better they were supposed to be depended on the mood of the moment. The degree of superiority ranged as high as 20 times better in the fall of 1943. There was still reason for this exaggeration. However, Holly had ended the Guadalcanal campaign with the assertion that the Japanese were not supermen, an opinion Tokyo's propagandists had fostered successfully throughout the world. In the first Halian days of their war, the subtle fear that such might be the case had penetrated deep into the American psyche, as Holly knew so well. His constant stream of verbal abuse against the Japanese verbal slur was really carefully measured propaganda for troop and American home consumption, for Halls understood the American press and its relationship to the public better than any other commander except MacArthur, in spite of the difficulties Holly had pulled off the victory, and in October 1943 was ready to take the next step toward Rabaul. The capture of Bugville, as the Japanese in the South Pacific knew very well the battle for Banville was going to be far more difficult than the one for New Georgia, and even more difficult than the battle for Guadalcanal. This is because Banville is the premier island of the Solomons, 130 miles long and 30 miles wide, with about the land area of the big island of Hawaii. It was not the land area, but the large number of bays and landing places that would give trouble weeks before the evacuation of Kangara. The Japanese had known what to expect. Soldiers moving around on Bugville had found carelessly discarded American K ration boxes at several points near the coastline. Japanese intelligence deduced that the Americans were searching for the most favorable point to stage a landing. Fortunately for the Americans, the boxes were found at widely disparate points, so they did not tip off the location of the coming landings for Japanese morale. It was just as well that the Japanese soldiers and sailors in the South Pacific were not aware of the futile nature of their defense activities in the spring before the New Georgia landings. The Imperial General Staff had, as noted, written off the whole area south of True and Rabaul. That was the reason for Admiral Kusaka's hesitation in completing the evacuation of Column Bangara, but on September 30th, Imperial Headquarters had instructed Admiral Kusaka and General Imamura to hold as long as possible all along the southeastern front. Despite talk of victory, the Imperial General Staff was under no illusions. The orders did not call for any last-man stands, and the orders were in no way peremptory. They used such terms as make every effort and were in fact most reasonable. These new instructions from Tokyo indicated that Rabaul must be the center of this defense line. The Japanese in the field were asked to make that effort to repulse all enemy attacks by protracted defense at Banville and in northern New Guinea. These are not the words of winners. The Imperial High Command had in no sense changed its strategic aim of the spring. The generals and admirals had simply persuaded themselves that the northern Solomons and New Guinea were to be held as long as possible without real possibility of success to give Tokyo time. The time was for the build-up and execution of offensives on two other fronts: China, where the Imperial Army was to drive into Chongqing, and India, where the army was to attack along the western border of Burma, and drive through Imphal toward Afghanistan after the Imperial General Headquarters had laid out the General Defense Program for senior command commanders. They passed it along. General Imamura, commander of the East Area Army, prepared a special message for all the units under his general command. This went out in a package with his own interpretation of the Imperial Staff's policy. Declaration on the right-hand side of the page, reading up and down as Japanese does, was printed. The Imperial General Staff's text on the left-hand side of the page was a detailed explanation of the policy and general orders, as well as IMMOA's instructions to every unit from the 17th Army Command down to the divisional and even regimental level concerning their specific responsibilities under the new orders. He used the word rei, meaning servant and follower, but also slave, to define the relationship of every serviceman to the Emperor and to country. That usage indicated the seriousness with which General Imamura regarded the obligation to defend the positions to which they were assigned. Some nothing new had been added. For the first time, The spirit of Bushido was being invoked as a matter of military policy. In essence, what General Imamura said was that each unit had responsibility to fight the delaying action asked by Tokyo to fight to the end as the troops from Kolom Bangara and the other Central Solomon Islands were brought back to safer Japanese areas. They were concentrated on Banville. Actually, the build-up of Banville as a base had begun under Admiral Yamamoto many months earlier. This big island was to be the staging area for renewed attacks on Allied positions to the south and east. In terms of material and installations, Banville was in a better position to serve that purpose than had been either New Georgia or the abandoned Kolom Bangara. Admiral Yamamoto, too, had supervised the cleanup of enemy intelligence activities on this island. He was helped in this by German missionaries who had no sympathy for the Americans and Australians, and who secured for the Japanese native support in locating the Allied coast watchers by the end of June 1943. Coast watcher Jack Reed had to report that after 15 months of occupation, Banville had become thoroughly pro-Japanese. None of the native Bougainvilleans could be trusted. Several parties of coast watchers and downflyers had betrayed the enemy. He was unable to secure up-to-date intelligence about Japanese movements, and unable to move around the island safely. Reed called for evacuation of all the coast watchers from the island. Consequently, all of these coast watchers were withdrawn in July 1943, and for the first time since the opening of the Guadalcanal campaign, the Allies seemed to have lost the intense advantage after the initial impact of return to civilization had worn off, as the planners planned at Numa and Brisbane. Several of the old Banville coast watchers schemed and agitated in Sydney. They tried to convince higher authority that they could go back into Banville before the invasion and make themselves useful. As for the Americans, the realization that the Japanese army forces on the ground were far more formidable than they had appeared at Guadalcanal brought about a change in H's plans for the move northward. Even as the fighting wound down in the Central Solomons, originally the step after New Georgia and Vel-Sel-Ala was to be up to the Shortland Islands. Since the beginning of the South Pacific Campaign, these islands had been a major Japanese base for sea and air operations, but in September, Hall's subordinate commanders agreed that this approach must be abandoned. At first they suggested an attack on Shazal, the next big island up the Solomons chain, almost opposite Vitlulay. But the main object of this whole drive was to isolate and destroy Rabaul as a base, and Schwaza was still too far away from Rabaul to permit ready air attack. This point was made by General MacArthur when the South Pacific plans were brought to him, and since he was the overall commander, those plans were changed. The next move was to be to Banville, and learning of this, the coast watchers renewed their battle to return to Banville, and in October it was agreed that the attempt would be made. Captain Eric Robinson, usually known as Wobby, because of a lisp led a party that would land in the north coast, Watcher Keenan. Another veteran of Banville led a party to the south. Keenan's party was landed on the southwest coast on October 26th by the submarine Guardfish, and the submarine then continued north to disembark Wobby's party. The latter landed between two Japanese camps and played hide-and-seek with the enemy for the next day or so before getting situated, so as to call for numerous airstrikes on Japanese positions when the time came. By the end of October, the Japanese had moved many men onto Banville. The island was headquarters for the Northern Solomons Defence Force, and around the Bun airfield, the 17th Army and the 6th Division had 15,000 men. The Navy's 8th Fleet had several hundred more men there, and at the No. 1 base headquarters at Shortland Bay, which consisted of about 6,800 men. Also the South Seas No. 4 garrison consisted of 5,000 men, plus the Navy's coast artillery battalions at the Shortlands and Balal Island. And Balal with its airfield was a completely Navy operation in the Gaza Bay Empress Augusta Bay area. The Army had stationed about 3,000 men, most of them in the south. The Navy had 200 men there at the Booker Air Base, and the installation around it, the Army stationed 5,000 men, and the Navy 1,000 men. Most of the force was in the south, where Kahili Kieta and Kara airfields were located. By far the most important of these was Kahili. The next largest force was established on the north tip of the island on both sides of the narrow Bua Passage that separates Bua Island from Banville, two important airfields. Were located there, Bonis and Bua, and the area chosen by Admiral H and his staff was at Empress Augusta Bay, a large semicircular indentation on the western side of the island. The specific point of landing would be at Cape Torokina, on the north end of the bay. In a sense, the choice was inevitable. The only other practical landing place was on the other side of the island, and that would have involved running the gamut of Japanese air bases from Schwaz to Rabaul. The great deficiencies of this landing place were the terrain, a low, swampy coastline, and the Ano Anage, which was unsuitable for large vessels. But Empress Augusta Bay it was to be. By mid-October the Japanese were certainly expecting something, but they did not know quite what. Admiral Koga, the chief of the combined fleet, had been bringing in aircraft to reinforce the 11th Air Fleet for 2 months, and more than 700 planes had come down the pipeline from Japan. Some of these had been lost in the battles over New Georgia and Column Bangara, but the strength of the force was growing in October. Koga added to it by assigning planes from the carrier fleet to the shore. He was planning another major air operation to slow the Americans down. The Allied air forces were still making inroads into the 11th Air Fleet with heavy air raids. The 5th United States Air Force on New Guinea was devoting its attention to Rabaul, which was still too far from American bases in the Solomons for effective attack. Admiral H's planes were attacking Banville here again, and then the war was reversed. The Japanese had staged at Munda to attack Guadalcanal. Now the Americans at Guadalcanal staged at Munda to attack Banville. The new Munda base worked day and night to service aircraft that came in many times after dusk. The failure of the Japanese airmen to come to grips with new technology and new problems was more apparent than ever. Japanese fighter discipline was limited. Once a fracas in the air began, it seemed to be every man for himself. The Allied airmen, to the contrary, stuck together, and almost always a fighter pilot had a wingman alongside for mutual protection. This difference led to such incidents as the second mission of P-38 Squadron 339. On October 10th, during the first mission of the day, the P-38S had escorted a B-24 bomber force on a raid of Cahill Airfield at the southern tip of Banville. In this mission, the pilot's job was to stick with the big boys and protect them from enemy fighter runs. They followed doctrine and still managed to shoot down or damage 4 Zeros with no losses of their own. In the afternoon, after refueling at Munda, the P-38S went on a second mission to escort a PBY Dumbo rescue plane that was looking for survivors from a crashed B-24 of the morning mission, who had been seen floating in the waters of the Coral Sea halfway along the rescue force, was jumped by 15 Zeros, and a melee began. The Japanese used their old dogfight technique, each pilot selecting a target and then going off on his own. The Americans followed disciplined 2 plane sections, sticking together and using scissor tactics for mutual protection. As a result, 5 Zeros were shot down and 5 more were damaged, while the United States' loss was limited to 1 plane that crash-landed at Munda and had to be junked. The pilot walked away. The American air effort was also causing serious destruction of planes on the ground, and as on October 12th, when the 5th Air Force made a major strike of B-25S and B-24S against the Rabaul port and airfields, they caught many planes on the ground and destroyed a number of them. Admiral Kusaka was eager to begin the new air effort against the American planes that were harrying Rabaul and Banville. Even now the myth persisted that Admiral Yamamoto's operation, one of the spring, had been effective. Kusaka certainly did speed up his efforts, aided by those planes coming down the Tokyo pipeline. Admiral Koga's plans were delayed, however, when on October 5th the American Pacific Fleet staged a carrier raid on Wake Island. This was the first carrier raid since the raid on Marcus Island early in September, and it was a part of the training program for the growing carrier force that would pave the way for the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. In November, Admiral Koga had no way of knowing this, and he suspected that the Americans were preparing to recapture Wake Koga's contribution to Japanese strategy, since he took over the combined fleet from the late Admiral Yamamoto had been to divest himself of day-to-day responsibility for the southeastern theater operations, so he could move the combined fleet out at a moment's notice to meet any American naval threat with this suspicion about Wake. He clustered the combined fleet at True and waited for further developments. They did not come. The Americans were also clustering at Pearl Harbor for the forthcoming assault on Tarawa and Makin atolls. In mid-October, the Japanese renewed their power play, but Admiral Koga and the Rabaul authorities misread the signals, instead of concentrating their air attacks on the Guadalcanal area, where Admiral Wilkinson was building up his amphibious landing force. The Japanese sent heavy raids against New Guinea on October 15th. A large formation of H-type 99 dive bombers, or VS, set out to attack Allied shipping in New Guinea-Orok Bay. Escorted by about 20 fighters, they took heavy casualties from the P-38S and did little damage. 2 days later, the Japanese tried again, this time with Army planes. The Kawasaki light bombers called lies by the Americans, and again the plane losses far outweighed the damage done. In the last days of October, the Allied raids on Rabaul was staged every flying day. B-24S and B-25S kept plastering Rabaul shipping, and the airfield's American planning for the Banville invasion was complete. The ships and men were assembled and assigned to the intricate bits of the jigsaw puzzle that would be the invasion from a naval viewpoint. The big problem was shortage. Admiral Holly wanted as much support from heavy fleet forces as he could get. Except for carriers with the capture of Vel-Lel-Wele, he now had a nice string of air bases, 3 on Guadalcanal 2 in the Russell, a big one at Munda and one on L'Isle Column Bangara having been evacuated. That island strips were also available if needed. What he did want was ships, destroyers, cruisers and battleships, and ships is what he did not get, because Admiral Nimitz estimated that Admiral Koga would not risk the major elements of his fleet in the Solomons. High would have to make do with what he had, except for one exchange of cruiser forces. Admiral Ainsworth's cruisers were returned to Pearl Harbor for work, and Admiral Lawrence Dubb's cruiser division was to replace them. Holly had one group of 2 carriers, 2 anti-aircraft cruisers, and 10 destroyers under Rear Admiral Frederick Sherman, Admiral Merrill's cruisers, and Captain Arleigh Burke's destroyers, plus perhaps another dozen destroyers to cover the Banville landings. Later on, he would get another carrier group and those cruisers under Rear Admiral Dubos, but they were not yet in place on the plus side. What he would have, however, was a ground force Marines, about which there could be no doubt at the end of the Guadalcanal campaign. Marine General Alexander Vandergrift had been relieved after he. On the beach, as the small craft carried the invading troops in, the barrage stopped 5 minutes before they were to land, and the landings were carried out at several points, and they drew very little reaction from the Japanese on Sterling Island. Some boats came under fire from machine guns, mortars, and one 40mm gun 1 boat was disabled, and 13 men were wounded, and several landing craft infantry had been converted into gunboats as an answer to fire from the shore, and one of them knocked out the twin-mounted 40mm guns. There was no doubt that the Japanese had been surprised, and defensive fire was spotty and slow incoming in some areas of the landing. There was no fire at all, but when the ships began to move into Blanche Harbour, several mountain guns began firing on them. When tank landing ship 399 came into land, she was subjected to mortar fire and received several direct hits. Also, only 25 feet back of her landing place was a strong pillbox, which spouted machine gun and rifle fire when the ramp was lowered, and men began moving forward. The first man off was shot dead. So were the second and the third, and the captain ordered the ramp closed up. The men aboard could not bring their guns to bear on the pillbox while aboard, and they could not get off the skipper of the tank. Landing ship asked for permission to back off the beach. It was denied. Then one of the New Zealanders saw that they had a bulldozer aboard the tank. Landing ship, he climbed aboard and raised the blade of the bulldozer to protect himself against frontal fire. The ramp was lowered, and the bulldozer went rumbling down onto the beach, with a half-dozen New Zealanders behind, sheltered by the side of the tank. Landing ship firing their Bren guns to cover him, the bulldozer driver moved around to the blind side of the pillbox, lowered the blade and ploughed exit pillbox and enter New Zealanders. The Japanese in Rabaul were surprised, as the Allies had hoped, and so no surface forces tried to interdict the early morning landing. But as the landings began, the word flashed to Rabaul, and the first airstrike of the day started out for the treasuries. Zeros arrived in mid-em morning and began mixing it up with the Allied air patrol, with casualties on both sides on the land. The defenders got better organized by noon and began directing effective gunfire from 75 mountain guns and mortars against the beach, and the ships off Sterling Island tank landing ship 399 took several hits, one of which wrecked her capstan machinery. Then a shell exploded in a dump of ammunition that had just been unloaded and threatened to destroy tank landing ship 399. At last she was given permission to back off the beach and delay her unloading. The first Japanese bombers arrived DED over the treasuries, but were met by P-38S at high altitude and P-39S and P-4S down low. A number of the Japanese planes were shot down, and as important, the attack was frustrated so that no ships were hit. Although unloading on the beach had to be suspended for an hour, the same pattern occurred on the other beaches of the treasuries where the Allies landed. The most stringent resistance was encountered by the New Zealanders, 29th and 36th Battalions that landed near Fami on Mono Island. They attacked the Japanese headquarters, which was west of the S River. The Japanese here had several heavy machine guns, heavy mortars, and 75 mountain guns. The New Zealanders moved in steadily and effectively before noon. Second Lieutenant LTG Booth led a platoon to capture 2 of the mountain guns, and an hour later he and his men captured a 90 mortar. They had only 27 wounded, and by nightfall the Japanese had been pushed back into the jungle, and the New Zealander beachhead was secure. That night the Japanese tried to recapture their headquarters area, which held most of their food supply, but they were driven off. The tactics of noise and confusion that had now become familiar to the Americans were new to the New Zealanders. But they weathered the storm well, although they lost 2 men dead and 9 wounded to rifle grenades and sniper fire altogether. That first day had been successful. The New Zealanders held the island, and altogether Americans and New Zealanders had suffered 115 casualties to take them. The Japanese had removed their dead and wounded, and their casualty figures were unknown at Tro and Rabaul. The Japanese High Command puzzled over the meaning of the Treasury Islands. Invasion Admiral Kogre could not resist the thought that it was a feint caught off base at the time of the Velulgele landings that had bypassed Kangara. The Japanese were now not quite sure what to expect. Their difficulty was increased by the activity on the New Guinea front, and for Admiral Kogre felt like a cat forced simultaneously to watch 2 rat holes on opposite ends of the kitchen. One could draw the conclusion that the air raids on Rabaul, the feint at the treasuries, and the increased air pressure from New Guinea meant an immediate invasion of New Britain Island. With that in mind, Admiral Kogre watched what the Allies were doing in the Solomons, but he did not take decisive action on the other hand. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo was much aroused by the events of October 27th. Tokyo did not much care whether the invasion was to be Banville or Schwaza or New Britain. What the Imperial General Staff did care about desperately was the maintenance of its long-range plan, called then the Rao Operation. The Rao Operation called upon the combined fleet to force the decisive battle on the Americans. Until that time, it was absolutely essential that the Southeast Area Command hold out every step of the way, and Tokyo so reminded Admiral Kogre on the night of October 27th. On October 28th, it rained hard all day. The New Zealanders moved around on the islands, extending their perimeters, and investigating the Japanese moved back doggedly. A few Zeros appeared, and several made low-level strafing attacks on the beaches, and exposed positions enemy bombers came over and dropped 30 bombs, but these fell harmlessly. In the jungle, the most vigorous fighting in the campaign came at the end, beginning on the last day of October, when the Japanese began a series of strong attacks near Sanu on the far side of Mono Island. These troops, the main body of the force on Mono Island, had moved from the Fomi area through the jungle of the Sanu River Valley. After several skirmishes, they attacked towards the beach on the night of November 1st, hoping to seize the American landing craft and get away. The fighting was fierce. Some of the Japanese reached the beach, but there they were stopped and did not get through. The New Zealanders suffered 10 casualties, and the Japanese left 50 dead on the field. The next night the Japanese tried again to break through, and they were once more driven back. The New Zealanders noticed that the second night's attack did not have the force of the first. That was because the Japanese force was cut in half, and this time it was virtually wiped out. That attack of November 2nd was the end of organized Japanese resistance in the Treasury Islands. The first phase of the invasion of Banville had been carried off, and the second phase of the Banville invasion was much more chancy in the planning of the Banville invasion. Admiral Holly had recognized the need for a real diversion in case the Japanese decided to resist in force this new move north. The logical choice was a feint against Schizzle, for if the Americans had not adopted the bypass strategy, Schwaz as the next island up the chain was the obvious target for invasion. In fact, Schwaz was H's choice until General MacArthur objected to it, so Schizzle had always been in the minds of the South Pacific planners to strengthen the Japanese suspicion that this island and the Shortlands would be the next target. Admiral Holly decided that on the same day that the Allied forces landed in the Treasury Islands, they would stage a commando-type raid on Schwaz. The UN chosen for the action was the 2nd Parachute Battalion of the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment for several weeks in September and October 1943. The Schizzle Coast Watcher Subal Lieutenant C.W. Satan of the Royal Australian Navy had been collecting information about the Japanese and the best landing areas on Chaz. All this was presented to General Vandergrift and Admiral Wilkinson at Guadalcanal late in October. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Track, commander of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, was ordered to Wilkinson's headquarters to confer on this raiding operation. At that meeting, General Vandergrift laid out the plan. What he wanted was the appearance of a major landing without the investment of many troops. It was decided that the landing should be made on the beaches of northwest Schwaza in the vicinity of Vosa village. Satan had reported that the Schwaz natives were friendly to the Allied cause. Unlike their neighbours at Beville, the beaches were good for landing. The Japanese installations in the area did not include many troops, although several thousand Japanese were known to be on the island. The 2nd Battalion of the Japanese 23rd Infantry Regiment was located in the northern part of the island, with an outpost at the village of Sangay, so the plan called for the landings an attack or two to establish the fact that a force was ashore, and then the establishment of a patrol base for PT boats with that information. Lieutenant Colonel Krulak went back to his 750-man battalion in camp on Vel-le-Ile to figure out how to make that number seem like 10 times as many on the afternoon of October 27th, as the Japanese at Rabaul were still reacting to the New Zealand landing in the Treasury Islands. Krulak and his men loaded up 4 destroyer transports and 8 landing craft since Japanese air activity around Chazal had been heavy recently. They stayed alongside the shore until after dark, and then headed across the water to Schwaza, escorted by the destroyer Conway. The night was just what they wanted. Dark and moonless, the sea was calm, and there were no Japanese in sight. But that calm did not last all the way across the Coral Sea. Shortly before midnight, the force was sighted by a Japanese float plane which dropped a bomb or two. The bombs scored a near miss on 1 destroyer transport, but did no real damage. It was uncomfortable enough, however, for Krulak and his officers to know that they were no longer alone. At about midnight, the ships reached a point a little more than a mile off the northwest coast of Schwaz and pulled up the landing. Coast Watcher Satan was waiting for the Marines with about 80 natives who would carry supplies. Another Japanese float plane came over and dropped 2 bombs near the Conway. No harm was done except to increase the tension of the men on the ships, and those going ashore by 2 o'clock in the morning. The landing was complete, and the ships were beginning to move away from Chazal leaving. Behind only 4 small landing craft for the Marines' use in scouting, Coast Watcher Satan led the battalion across the beach, then into the jungle and up a trail, until at 6 o'clock in the morning they had reached a wooded plateau a mile above Visa. This point was to be the base of operations with outposts up and down the beach. The Japanese now knew the Allies had come, but just where they had landed was a different matter after the Marines had moved in. Sure, a party of natives had gone back to the beach and brushed away every boat, mark every boot track, every sign of a landing of foreigners in the morning. Japanese planes came over, searched the area and bombed, but without effect. They had not discovered the hiding place of the Marines. The next step for Lieutenant Colonel Krulak was to let the Japanese know incontrovertibly that the Marines had landed. He led a patrol to the bank of the Vagara River, where the Marines discovered a handful of Japanese unloading a Daihatsu, The Marines took cover and ambushed the Japanese, and they sank. The landing barge killed 7 Japanese and left the bodies on the beach that would make the point that same day. A squad of Marines of Company F went out on another patrol in the Vergara River vicinity. They were supposed to set up an ambush for any Japanese patrol that came along too, but they did not fare so well. They encountered a Japanese patrol and got into a fight, and when it was over, the sergeant in command could find only 2 of his men, so who had ambushed whom on October 29th, Lieutenant Commander Krulak decided to make an attack on the Japanese positions at Sangi. It was scheduled for the next day. He ordered up an airstrike, and dutifully at 6:10 in the morning of October 30th, a dozen torpedo bomber fighters and 26 Navy fighters came in to drop 2 tons of bombs in the area. At that point, there were about 150 Japanese at Sangi, but reinforcements were not far away to the south, and they could be expected to show up soon after the bombing. The Marines were already in motion. Moving up to Visa village, where they found the rest of the missing squad intact, the battalion then waited for landing craft to come up and take them to the vicinity of the Vergara River when the boats showed up. However, they were mistakenly identified by some of those attacking planes as Japanese, and strafed until one Marine pulled out an American flag and began waving it. The aviators then ceased and desisted and buzzed them, giving the thumbs-up sign. Since nobody had been hurt, the Marines could return it without too many curses. The friendly air attack had damaged one landing boat, so the battalion had to give up the idea of approaching by sea. Led by local scouts, the men marched until they reached a point near the Vergara River, where they ran onto a Japanese outpost. After firing a few shots, the Japanese fell back to their base at Sangi. Lieutenant Colonel Krulak then began his attack. He intended to envelop the position. One company would move down the beach line and attack from the north. The rest of the battalion would move inland around Sangi and attack from the east. They set out Company E coming down. The coast had little trouble. Company F going inland found the terrain difficult. They were marching through rainforest with its high trees cutting out the light, slippery footing on muddy ground, lianas, creepers and roots to trip them up further. This unit was accompanied by the machine gun section and part of an experimental rocket platoon, and this meant heavy equipment. The going was slow and HR was supposed to be 2 p.m., but at that time E Company was still more than a mile from its objective.